The cameras rolled as Donald Trump adjusted his microphone, his expression composed but alert. The stage was set for another high-profile interview, something he had done countless times before. He sat upright, his hands resting on the table, radiating confidence. Across from him, the reporter shuffled his notes, eyes sharp, already calculating how this conversation would unfold. The energy in the room was thick with anticipation. Viewers across the country were tuning in, knowing that any live interview with Trump had the potential to turn into something explosive. The opening moments were routine, questions about policy, the economy, the upcoming election. Trump answered with his usual assertiveness, reinforcing his message to the American people. Then the shift happened. The reporter leaned in slightly, his voice controlled but firm. "There's been a lot of talk lately about your influence. Some within your own party believe your grip isn't as strong as it once was. That people are starting to move on." For a split second, something flickered in Trump's eyes, an almost imperceptible pause before he responded. "Who's saying that?" he shot back, his tone still even but edged with curiosity. The reporter didn't hesitate. "Several high-profile Republicans, some of your own former allies. They're quietly distancing themselves. Does that concern you?" Trump exhaled sharply, leaning back slightly. "That's nonsense. Everyone knows that. The people know that." His voice remained steady, but there was a shift in his posture, his fingers lightly tapping the table, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The reporter wasn't done. "Then why are we seeing reports of key endorsements slipping away? Why are some of your closest allies refusing to publicly back you the way they once did?" The air in the room thickened. Trump's expression darkened, his lips pressing together for a fraction of a second before he spoke. "Look, I've built a movement bigger than anyone ever thought possible. These people, whoever they are, know that without me, they don't have that movement." The tension crackled between them. The reporter wasn't letting up, and Trump could sense it. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every slight reaction, every shift in body language. The next question was coming. He could feel it. And something about the way the reporter was looking at him told him this wasn't going to be just another interview. The reporter flipped through his notes, glancing up with the slightest smirk. He could sense the shift in energy, the way Trump's posture had changed just enough to show that the question had landed. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "You've built a movement, sure," the reporter said, his tone steady. "But some say that movement is shrinking, that your influence isn't what it used to be." He paused, letting the words settle. "That maybe you're losing control." Trump's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped the table once, then stopped. The silence stretched for half a second longer than usual, just enough for the audience at home to feel it. Then he leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Losing control?" he repeated, shaking his head. "That's what the media wants people to believe. The truth is, the American people, real Americans, not the ones sitting in newsrooms, know exactly what's happening in this country." The reporter didn't flinch. He nodded slightly as if he had expected that response. "Then why are we seeing more division within your own party?" Trump scoffed, waving a hand. "You're talking about a handful of weak politicians, people who wouldn't have won a single election without my endorsement. And now they think they can do it without me? Good luck." The room was thick with tension now. The camera zoomed in, catching every movement, every flicker of expression. "But if that's the case," the reporter pressed, "why are we seeing major donors shifting their support elsewhere? If your influence is as strong as you say, shouldn't they still be backing you without hesitation?" Trump exhaled sharply through his nose. "You know how politics works. It's all a game. Some of these people, big money guys, they follow whoever they think will help them the most. But guess what? The voters don't care about donors. The voters care about results. And nobody delivers results like I do." The reporter tilted his head slightly. "So, you don't think there's any truth to these reports?" Trump's mouth pressed into a firm line. "I think the media is desperate. They can't stop talking about me even when they pretend I don't matter." The air in the studio had shifted completely. The usual controlled rhythm of the interview was gone. The next question was going to hit harder. The question that would push things past the point of no return. The reporter leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight of the moment. He had Trump's full attention now, and so did the cameras. Every slight change in posture, every flicker of emotion was being recorded, analyzed, and absorbed by millions watching at home. He adjusted his pen between his fingers, then spoke with calculated precision. "But let's talk about something even bigger," he said. "Many of your supporters have stood by you through everything, but even some of them have started asking the same question. What if Trump can't win?" Trump's expression hardened instantly. His shoulders squared, and his lips pressed together in a thin line. He had handled countless interviews, countless tough questions, but this one was different. It wasn't just about influence or endorsements. It was about his place in history. The reporter didn't stop there. "There are polls showing that some voters, your voters, are worried about your chances in a general election. Some say that another candidate could have a better shot at beating the Democrats. What do you say to them?" Trump's reaction was immediate. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Let me tell you something," he said, jabbing a finger on the table for emphasis. "No one, and I mean no one, has ever energized this country like I have. We brought millions of new people into politics, people who had never voted before. And you think they're going to walk away now? Not a chance." The reporter didn't back down. "But even within your own party, there are those who say your brand of politics is becoming a liability, that voters are fatigued by the constant controversies." Trump scoffed. "Fatigued? Let me tell you who's fatigued. The American people. They're tired of weak politicians who make big promises and deliver nothing. They know that I fight, and they love me for it." The atmosphere had shifted completely. The controlled pace of the conversation was gone, replaced by something more raw, more unpredictable. The reporter glanced at his notes, then back at Trump. He had one more question, one that would push this interview beyond anything the former president was willing to tolerate. Trump was already bracing for it, his patience hanging by a thread. The room felt like a pressure cooker, moments from boiling over. And then, with a steady voice, the reporter asked it. The reporter didn't hesitate. He had Trump locked in, and this was the moment to land the biggest question of the night. He adjusted his posture slightly, as if settling in before delivering the blow. "You talk about fighting, about the people loving you for it," he said, his tone steady. "But what if the fight is actually hurting the country?" Trump's eyes narrowed. "Hurting the country?" he repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. The reporter leaned in, keeping his voice firm but controlled. "Your legal battles, your controversies, the way every election cycle seems to revolve around you. Some people say that's the problem, that your presence, your brand, is dividing the nation even further, that maybe it's time for America to move forward without you." The silence in the studio was deafening. The weight of the words hung between them, heavier than anything that had come before. Trump's expression darkened, his patience visibly thinning. He had been challenged before, had been pressed on tough issues, but this wasn't just about politics now. This was about legacy, about being told to his face that his time was up. His voice dropped, slow and deliberate. "You think this country is divided because of me?" The reporter didn't flinch. "Many believe that." Trump scoffed, shaking his head. "The country was divided long before I came along. The only difference is that I refuse to pretend otherwise, and that scares a lot of people." The reporter pressed again, undeterred. "But do you think America can heal with you still at the center of it all?" Trump exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the table. His next words came with the force of someone who had been holding them in, waiting for the right moment. "America doesn't need healing. It needs strength, and the people know I'm the one who brings it." The tension in the room reached its peak. The audience watching at home could feel it through their screens. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion in Trump's face. The reporter glanced at him, then back at his notes. He wasn't done. He had one more question. the kind that didn't just challenge someone, but dared them to walk away. Trump's breathing was controlled, but his grip on the table suggested otherwise. He was already making a decision, and when the next question came, it would be the breaking point. The reporter flipped to the last page of his notes, though he hardly needed them now. The interview had taken on a life of its own. Every shift in Trump's posture, every change in his tone, told him exactly where the conversation was headed. He took a breath and delivered the final question. "Mr. Trump, if you lose again, will you accept the results?" The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the studio seemed to freeze. Trump's expression changed instantly. His jaw set, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his grip on the table became almost imperceptibly tighter. His eyes locked onto the reporter with a look that was equal parts disbelief and irritation. "That's a ridiculous question," he said, his voice lower now, slower, measured. The reporter didn't let up. "Is it? Millions of Americans, on both sides, want to know. They want to be sure that if you run and lose, you'll accept the outcome without contesting it." Trump leaned forward slightly, his patience hanging by a thread. "I'll tell you what's ridiculous," he said, his tone now carrying the weight of restrained frustration. "The fact that we're even talking about this when we should be talking about the disaster this country is in right now. The economy, the border, crime, real issues." The reporter kept his eyes locked on Trump. "So, you're saying you won't give a clear answer?" Trump exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "I'm saying that if an election is fair, there's no issue. But let's be real. Everyone saw what happened last time. Everyone knows." The words landed heavily, echoing through the room. There was no mistaking the meaning. The reporter didn't blink. "So, to be clear, you're saying you wouldn't commit to accepting the results?" That was it. The moment Trump had been trying to avoid. His shoulders tensed, his fingers drummed against the table once before he reached up and unfastened his microphone. "I'm done," he muttered. The audience gasped as he pushed back his chair, standing abruptly. The camera crew scrambled to adjust their angles. The reporter sat motionless, watching as Trump pulled the mic from his lapel, set it down, and without another word, turned and walked off the stage. The studio remained silent, stunned. The interview wasn't just over, it had just become a headline. The cameras kept rolling as Trump walked off, his broad frame disappearing behind the stage. The sound of his footsteps echoed slightly in the stunned silence of the studio. For a moment, no one moved. The crew exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to cut to commercial or keep the feed running. The reporter remained seated, his hands resting on the desk, watching the empty space where Trump had just been. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly before turning to face the camera. "Well," he said, his voice even, "I think that speaks for itself." The control room immediately cut to a wide-angle shot, capturing the murmurs in the audience. Some were whispering, others sat frozen in disbelief. This wasn't just another tense exchange. This was a moment that would be dissected, analyzed, and replayed across every network for days to come. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Trump's team moved quickly. A senior aide caught up with him just as he exited through the back door of the set. "Mr. President, we can spin this," the aide said in a low, urgent voice. "You stood your ground. You didn't let them bait you." Trump barely glanced over. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his posture said everything. He had been in 1,000 interviews before, had faced 100 tough questions, but this one had gotten under his skin in a way few ever had. Outside, cameras were already flashing, reporters shouting questions as he made his way to the waiting SUV. "President Trump, why did you walk out?" one voice called. "Do you think this will hurt your campaign?" Trump didn't answer. He slid into the vehicle, the door shutting behind him with a heavy thud. His team followed closely, their phones buzzing nonstop as the news exploded online. Within minutes, the headlines flooded social media. "Trump walks out of live interview after tough question on election results." "Shocking moment, Trump storms off national broadcast." Did Trump just lose control on live TV? Back in the studio, the anchor cut to a panel discussion. Analysts were already weighing in, debating whether Trump had shown strength or weakness. The country was split, as it always was, but one thing was certain. Trump had left the room, but the conversation about him had only just begun. Inside the SUV, the silence was thick. Trump stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, fingers tapping lightly against his knee. The hum of the car's engine filled the space, but no one spoke. His top aides sat beside him, exchanging quick, nervous glances. They had seen him irritated before, but this was different. This was personal. A notification pinged on one of their phones, then another, then another. The internet was already ablaze. Clips of the walkout were everywhere, headlines rolling in by the second. Some news outlets framed it as a power move, a refusal to engage in media traps. Others painted it as a rare moment of defeat. One aide cleared his throat. "Sir, social media is split. Your base is rallying, calling it a stand against biased media. But the other side—" Trump cut him off with a wave of his hand. "They were always going to say something, doesn't matter what," he said, his voice firm. "They twist everything. That guy wasn't asking questions, he was setting up a hit job." The aide nodded quickly. "Right, and that's how we frame it. You weren't going to waste time on dishonest reporting. We push back, say you walked out because you refused to legitimize their narratives." Trump exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It wasn't just the question," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's the same game every time. They don't care about answers. They care about the reaction." The SUV pulled into a private entrance at Trump Tower. As the door opened, another flash of cameras greeted him. Paparazzi, reporters, everyone waiting for a soundbite, a response. He stepped out, buttoning his jacket, ignoring the noise around him. Inside, his team moved fast. A statement was already being drafted, posts lined up for his social media accounts. They had to control the message before anyone else did. Meanwhile, the network aired replays of the interview on a loop. Analysts debated what had just unfolded. Was this a calculated walkout, or had the reporter struck a nerve? Some called it a show of dominance. Others called it an uncharacteristic moment of vulnerability. But one thing was clear. Trump had left the stage, but he was still the center of the conversation. And by morning, the headlines would still be all about him. By morning, the interview was everywhere. News channels dissected every second. Talk shows debated its impact, and social media was flooded with reactions. Clips of Trump walking off the set played on repeat, each outlet spinning the moment in its own way. At Trump Tower, his team had already launched a counteroffensive. His official statement was out, calling the interview a sham and accusing the reporter of pushing a predetermined narrative. His supporters rallied behind him, praising him for refusing to play into the media's hands. They saw the walkout as a sign of strength, proof that he wouldn't be bullied. His critics, however, had a different take. They claimed it was a rare moment where he had been cornered, where the pressure had actually gotten to him. For years, Trump had dominated interviews, controlled the energy in the room. But this time, some argued, he had lost control. Despite the controversy, one thing was undeniable. Everyone was talking about him. Cable networks brought in panel after panel, each trying to answer the same question. Was this a calculated move, or did the reporter finally push him too far? Some believed he had walked out to keep his narrative intact, refusing to engage in an argument he couldn't control. Others saw it as an emotional reaction, a moment of frustration boiling over. Meanwhile, Trump himself was already looking ahead. In a private meeting with his advisors, he waved off concerns about the fallout. "People don't remember the questions," he said, his voice calm, assured. "They remember the moment, and this is the moment." His team nodded, already planning the next rally, the next speech, the next move to capitalize on the attention. They knew the media would keep the story alive for days, but Trump had no intention of letting it define him. Back in the newsroom, the reporter who had conducted the interview was asked for his reaction. He offered a small smile and simply said, "I asked the question." He made the choice. The dust hadn't settled yet, but one thing was certain. Love him or hate him, Trump had once again done what he did best. He had made sure the world was still talking about him. This wasn't just an interview. It was a defining moment. Whether you saw strength or frustration, one thing is clear. Trump owns the conversation, even when he walks away. What would you have done? Engaged in the debate or left the stage? Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say. It's knowing when to stop talking